you may have missed some key information, as well as there may be some sensitive information that's discussed today. So we want to make sure that each and every one of you all know that if you need a break, what we call a self-care break, please make sure you do that. Take some time away for a second, because the information when we're talking about human trafficking is definitely very pulled on our heart. So make sure you take time for yourself if you need to do that. So again, we won't hesitate any longer. We'll go ahead and get started with our two speakers. We have two amazing speakers today that I've had the pleasure of working with. So we have Miss Amy Boney. Miss Amy is the director of our Human Commercial Sexually Exploited Children Response Team here in Georgia. She also serves for the Georgia Coalition to Combat Human Trafficking as the chair for the Victim Services Subcommittee. She is leading a very diverse team of professionals who provide services 24 hours a day, 7 days a week here in Georgia. They provide assessments as well as other resources for crisis of those youth and others that may be dealing with human trafficking issues. And then we have Naeshia McDowell. She is the statewide child and youth care coordinator for our CSEC response team with the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia. She serves as the center point of contact for agencies and victims for more effective services throughout the state. She can be reached, I will say this personally, she can be reached at all times of day or night, as well as helping with the 1-800-Children's Hotline. So thank you both for coming in to speak with us today, and we will turn it over to Naeshia McDowell and Amy Boney.
And Naeshia and Amy, before you guys get started, just another quick reminder, I'm actually going to mute everybody, just again to kind of cut down on some of that feedback that we might hear in the background. So Naeshia and Amy, I'm going to mute everyone really quickly so you guys remember to unmute yourselves before you start.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you shared that disclaimer, because I definitely had to select unmute again. So thank you for that. All right. So good afternoon. I was about to say good morning, everyone. Thank you all again for spending your lunch hour with us to discuss Family Facilitated CSEC. And really the goal of this presentation is to demystify a form of exploitation that often goes unrecognized and unreported. So to kick us off, we just want to know who's in our audience today. I know many of you may participate in the task force, but we want to get an idea of who's represented today. So if you could put in the chat which professional groups you're representing, whether it's law enforcement, DFAC, social work, child advocacy, medical prevention, juvenile justice, or even CASA. So if you could just put that in the chat for us so we can have an idea of who we're speaking with today. So I see a few high school counselors popping up. Thank you all for being here. Law enforcement, advocacy, DFACs, elementary school counselors, Georgia DOE, that's great. High school counselors as well. DJJ is in the building. So we're really excited to be joined by you all today, because each of you intersect with kids in a unique and meaningful way, and may be able to really speak to some of the challenges that we have when it comes to family facilitated commercial sexual exploitation. So let me do a quick tech check and just make sure, if you could give me a thumbs up if you can actually see our presentation here, or you can just put a quick yes in the chat if you can see it. All right, I'm thinking folks can see it, so that's good to know. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. So just to give you all some background information on the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia, specifically the CSEC response team, our mission is to really serve as the central point of contact for victims of CSEC. And when we say CSEC, we'll sort of shorten it for the purposes of this presentation, but we are referring to commercial sexual exploitation of children. So our goal is to really serve as that support for agencies and the youth that are impacted by this issue for a more coordinated and effective system response. As the CSEC response provider for the state of Georgia, the CSEC response team of the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia was determined by a competitive grant process. And this process was reviewed by child welfare partners, including the Department of Family and Children Services, the Department of Juvenile Justice, and our court-appointed special advocates as well. The CSEC response team of CACGA is supported by the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council and endorsed by the Governor and First Lady Kemp as well. Our response, just to give you some background on our services, provides direct services for victims in the form of assessment, intensive case management. We also facilitate training and outreach to help build infrastructure and community capacity. And we are the state of Georgia's recognized enhanced collaborative model for responding to CSEC. And what that means is we use our network of 52 child advocacy centers throughout the state as the foundation of our response. And we just want to give a special shout out to all of our CACs for the amazing work that they do day in and day out for our youth, especially those being victimized by exploitation. So we're so grateful for you and our core team at the CSEC response team. Glad to see you all on. So let's get started with just some basic definitions. We are glad to know that most of the folks on this call have some basic or foundational understandings of what commercial sexual exploitation is. But our friends over at Rights for Girls, which is a nonprofit organization in DC, actually organizes CSEC into 4 different paradigms. And that's family facilitated, gang facilitated, trafficker and pimp facilitated, and then survival sex. And so due to the information that we've come across through our cases and what the feedback that we've received from our child advocacy centers, we decided to add a 5th paradigm based on cases that we've encountered, and that's technology facilitated CSEC. But for today's purposes, we just wanted to share that it can be broken down into different sort of categories, but we're going to be focused specifically on familial trafficking or family facilitated CSEC, which occurs when a family member exchanges sexual acts with the child for goods, substances, rent, services, money, or status within the community. And family members can include parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, etc., anyone responsible for the immediate care of that child. So what we're going to do is take a look at a video. It's actually sort of the remnants of a court case where a mother here in Georgia was convicted of basically selling her daughter. So give me 1 second. We're going to pull up the video so we can take a look.
So Naeshia, when you share the video, you do have to select share. There's like a little button that you select so that we can actually hear it.
Perfect. Thank you, ma'am. There we go. Thank you, Devaja. Okay.
Children, in exchange for money, will spend 20 years in prison. The victims were only 5 and 6 years of age. It's incomprehensible. 11 alive, Doug Richards, in court as the sentence was handed down by a Fulton County judge. Doug?
Well, Jeff, this is certainly a story that has shocked the conscience. This is a woman who, as you said, has to allowing men to rape her 2 daughters, ages 5 and 6. As she was led out of the courtroom and to a jail cell, Morgan Summerlin blew kisses to family members who sat and watched the sentencing. A few minutes later, the woman's grandfather told a judge that there had been an additional incident victimizing a 12-year-old family member, which prosecutors said was similar to the other 2 child rape cases, but they declined to describe that incident in detail in public. It was enough, though, for Judge Constance Russell to sentence Summerlin to serve 20 years in prison, with another 10 on probation, and prosecutors say she will not be eligible for parole during the 20 years in prison. Russell was 25 when she pleaded guilty. Her defense attorney says that the defendant was herself sexually exploited and attacked as a child, hinting at a horrifying and continuing cycle of abuse. The 2 young victims in this case were not in court, did not speak in court. A family member who was in court said that the family is now trying to take care of those 2 young victims and helping them put all this behind them to whatever extent that's possible. Back to you.
So we'd like to share some of that information because it's so easy to assume that this type of issue is not happening in our state and even within our immediate communities. And so it's so important that as we continue to learn more about this issue, that we share data, resources, and even supplemental information that can support the fact that this is happening here in the state of Georgia as well. So let's jump into some differences between family facilitated CSEC and then our intrafamilial sexual abuse. So it's easy to confuse family facilitated CSEC for intrafamilial sexual abuse. However, the two are distinct in some ways. In family facilitated CSEC cases, the presence of an economic exchange, regardless of the form of commerce, is present. Some intrafamilial sexual abuse victims may receive money, rewards, or incentive to ensure their silence or their compliance as a part of the abuser's grooming behavior. And so it's very difficult sometimes to separate the two. Oftentimes, when there is a family facilitated CSEC case, it may hide under the guise of some intrafamilial sexual abuse or some grooming being utilized by the caregiver. And so we just wanted to point out some of those differences. However, there can be some similarities in the fact that both intrafamilial sexual abuse and family facilitated CSEC normalize unwanted sexual acts and are unspoken yet distinct forms of abuse against children. So we definitely want to express the fact that the two are very similar. So we want to know, what are your experiences with cases such as sexual abuse or even family facilitated CSEC? So if you could put a 1 in the chat if you've been a part of an intrafamilial sexual abuse case that ultimately became a family facilitated CSEC case. So basically, at the beginning of the investigation, everyone on your MDT was on board that this would be intrafamilial sexual abuse. But after digging a little bit deeper, your MDT found that this youth may have been exploited by their caregiver. So I see a few people putting 1s in the chat here. Thank you, Casey, for that. So a few of you have had some experiences with cases such as this. And as we learn more about this issue, which is honestly not being researched, there's not a lot of research out there about family facilitated CSEC. But as we learn more, many of us may reflect and think, wow, we did have a case like that come through our center. The signs were there. We just didn't know what to look for. So thank you all for putting your 1s in the chat. I see many of you have had that experience. So let's talk about prevalence numbers, because everybody wants to know, what are the stats? What are the statistics? How often is it occurring? What are the incidents? Things like that. So prevalence numbers on cases of familial trafficking are difficult to derive due to a few reasons. One being that family facilitated CSEC is often categorized as other types of abuse, such as child abuse, child endangerment, contributing to the delinquency of a minor, sexual assault, or even coercion or enticement. You must also consider that a child is often unaware of an exchange for any goods or money or something of value, and therefore can't always confirm whether or not family facilitated CSEC actually occurred. Several studies have explored the incidence and prevalence of family facilitated CSEC by using some retrospective proxy studies or surveys, or reviewing case data for organizations that serve youth impacted by CSEC. And these studies estimate that between 30 and 40% of CSEC experiences are facilitated by family members or caregivers. And when we consider, most of us know this stat, right? When we consider that 34% of child sexual abuse is inflicted by a family member, it's not really difficult for us to perceive how common family facilitated CSEC is. A 2019 report from the National Human Trafficking Hotline reported that a familial relationship was the second most common form of induction into commercial sex after intimate partner induced exploitation. According to our data here in the state of Georgia, the trafficker is a family member in about 20 to 25% of confirmed child sex trafficking cases. And there is also a subset of cases, which we'll talk about a little bit later, where we don't always know who the exact trafficker is due to the child's inability to disclose, or just their they don't want to disclose that information just yet. So while the prevalence numbers on cases of family facilitated CSEC are difficult to derive, we must also anticipate that the current state of our world, lockdowns, unemployment, children not in school, things like that, are also lending fuel to the fire and fuel to the possibility of more family facilitated CSEC cases. So let's look at some common forms of CSEC here in the state of Georgia. And so we wanted to bring this data to you all because we often get questions around, what does it look like here in our state? And so for us, out of the confirmed cases that we've seen, family facilitated CSEC is commonly the third most common form of commercial sexual exploitation for our kids. The most common form is typically CSEC facilitated by an acquaintance. And when we say an acquaintance, we mean someone that the child is familiar with, or has been in school or involved in school with, or has some type of relationship with, not necessarily. However, we also have our second most common form, which is technology facilitated CSEC. And with this form, I'm sorry, it's actually the most common form. This is where our youth are using social media as a means of exploitation. And so there may not necessarily be, I see a comment about the volume being low. Is everyone able to hear me pretty clearly?
I can hear you just fine, Naeshia, but again, I'm going to go ahead and remute everybody once more, just again to try and help out with some of that background. So you guys just remember to unmute yourselves.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. I just wanted to pause and make sure everyone could hear. Thank you. So the technology facilitated CSEC, where youth are using the internet or other social media as a means of exploitation, occurs where there may not necessarily be a trafficker, but there's a third party involved in purchasing or providing monetary exchanges to that youth for sexual acts, photos, things of that nature. So that's a common form that we're seeing here in our state, or it's just more recognizable because we have adults that are vigilant on social media and things of that nature. Also, we have our trafficker facilitated CSEC as well. That is a common form of exploitation that we see. And then survival sex, of course, and then other forms of exploitation where the child has not disclosed exactly the means or the methods of that exploitation or who the trafficker is. But of course, we know that it's occurring through their disclosure and the information that they have provided. So we want to share a list of characteristics of youth impacted by other forms of exploitation to offer a compare and contrast with family facilitated CSEC. Youth impacted by gang trafficking, technology facilitated CSEC, or trafficker facilitated CSEC may have some of the following characteristics. They may be chronic, truant, runaway, homeless, or gang involved youth. They may be our LGBTQ plus youth. They may be children involved in foster care and juvenile justice systems, or they're dual system involved youth. They may have substance dependence disorders, friends and associates that are involved in CSEC or sex work and trafficking, and they may also have a high number of suspected sexual partners as well. However, when we look at our youth that are being impacted by family facilitated CSEC, which is a unique form of trafficking, and in many ways, we're just beginning to understand this form of trafficking, family facilitated CSEC can be difficult to identify because it takes place within the family network and victimizes children that are sometimes too young to understand what is happening to them. So as a result, some characteristics of children impacted by this issue may be slightly different from our kids that are being impacted by some other forms of CSEC. So characteristics may include younger victims. So one study conducted by Sprang and colleagues found that the average age of a victim of familial trafficking in the United States to be 5 years old, with some children victimized as early as infancy. Family members may also be involved in the illegal commercial sex industry. Youth are less likely to be a runaway. A study conducted by Reed and colleagues found that children trafficked by relatives were less likely to report running away and less likely to report alcohol and drug use. Now, when we think about this, it could be due to the age group that is being surveyed or studied. At the time of their initial exploitation, they may have been too young to initiate running away, or escaping that exploitive scenario, or they may have been too young to engage or have access to alcohol and drugs. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. Additionally, children may have child welfare involvement for neglect. One study found that of the cases of children that had child welfare involvement, 94% of confirmed family facilitated CSEC cases had a primary finding of neglect. So when child welfare services were initially involved with that child, all that they were able to find or confirm was childhood neglect. However, after further investigation, it was found that the child was also being exploited by a family member. They're also more likely to have witnessed domestic violence. There can be some frequent moving and relocation, so that's definitely something to look out for with your families. They may be less likely to be identified as a CSEC victim by child welfare services. One study found that over half of victims of family facilitated CSEC were poly victims, meaning they had multiple experiences of abuse and neglect, sexual abuse, and maybe witnessing some domestic violence as well. So as we talk about some perpetrator characteristics, one surprising finding for many is that mothers are the most common type of trafficker in familial trafficking cases. So those of you on the call may not be surprised about this at all, but some of our greater community members are surprised to learn that mothers are typically involved in some of the exploitation, and that's on a national level, and we'll talk about what that looks like here in Georgia. In Georgia, a child's mother was the trafficker in 25% of cases, and an individual associated with the mother was a trafficker in 33% of cases. So if the mother had a paramour, boyfriend, or another relative involved in the trafficking, that was happening for our Georgia cases in 33% of those cases. Studies find that the mother-daughter relationship is the most common type of perpetrator-victim relationship as well. However, all children, whether they identify as male, female, or any other gender, can be victims. One study identified 3 roles that a mother trafficker will commonly play in their child's exploitation. The first being that the mother trafficker is the madam, or the person who introduces the child and sells the child within exploitation. The second can be the mother trafficker as an addict, meaning sex and sexual acts with the child were being exploited to support the mother's drug habit. And thirdly, the mother trafficker as a mentor or tutor, which occurs when the mother, who is likely already involved in the illegal commercial sex industry, trains her youth in exploitation. And we just want to note that these can happen in tandem with one another. They don't have to happen separately or siloed. The mother can be all 3 at one time. Here's just a quote from a survivor that was found in one of the studies. She's, and I'll just read it out for her. She was the one, and she's referring to her mother, that introduced me to the life when I was 13. Then she had a drug dealer that lived right next door. He was my mom's drug dealer. My mom just, in other words, sold me to him for drugs. So he was a pimp. My mom knew everything that was going on, but didn't do anything. So that's just one example of how the mother may have a substance dependence disorder, and it's being fueled by a person who is exploiting her substance dependence for access to that child. Some additional perpetrator characteristics include fathers, and fathers are the second most common type of trafficker in family facilitated CSEC cases. The Spring and Cole study found that a child's father was a trafficker in 32% of cases. For our data in Georgia, it revealed that a child's father was a trafficker in 13% of cases. And so oftentimes when a child is disclosing, they may not necessarily disclose what additional parents may have been involved. If they disclose at all that the parents were involved in the exploitation. And Amy's going to talk about what that looks like and why sometimes our kids are hesitant to disclose certain details around their exploitation. And she'll also cover some barriers to recognition and disclosure as well. Fathers were often motivated by money and status within their immediate community, and oftentimes access to other children and access to child sexual abuse material was also another motivation in the research. The Spring and Cole study found that other family members were the trafficker in 3.2% of cases, and their motivations were mostly financial. However, here in Georgia, other family members were the trafficker in 58% of cases. And so that's drastically different from some of the data that we're seeing across the country. And some of that, what we're looking to do is to extract some of the data on when a mother, her paramour, or other individuals associated with the mother are involved in that trafficking, and understanding whether or not the mother knew about it, about the exploitation, or was complicit in that child's exploitation. So that's some data that our team is really wanting to extract in the next year or so. So let's talk about some perpetrator methods. How are our traffickers exploiting children? What methods are they using, so that as professionals that serve children, we have an understanding of what to look out for, and that we also are not assuming that this type of exploitation is only happening within the family home. So children can be exploited by family members in several ways. They may be exploited within the family home. They may be forced into street exploitation. They may be transported to other homes and businesses to be exploited. They can also be photographed or recorded for child sexual abuse materials, or even forced to work in strip clubs. Family members and caregivers may use threats, intimidation, and parental authority to recruit and maintain the victim. However, a caregiver or family member's authority over the child is usually sufficient to compel them to obedience. So just keeping in mind that oftentimes our kids have a relationship with the individuals that they are being exploited by. They love them, they care about them, they don't want to necessarily leave the home. They just want the abuse and the exploitation to end. And so that can be very difficult when you have an MDT that's investigating the child's exploitation and wanting to make sure that all perpetrators are held accountable. So just something to keep in mind here, sort of a consider this. When the family member is the trafficker, the exploitation is often normalized and accepted within the family culture, sometimes spanning generations. And so understanding that sometimes our kids will come to our child advocacy centers, to our hospitals, and not understand that something is going terribly wrong within their family structure, and the exploitation is actually not supposed to happen just due to the way that their family is set up. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Miss Amy Boney to talk about some ways, barriers to recognition and disclosure for Family Facilitated CSEC.
Thank you, Naeshia. So in looking at barriers to recognize disclosures, we have to be considerate of harmful misperceptions about where and how Family Facilitated CSEC happens. A child's inherent loyalty to and reliance on the family structure. And I really think that's one of the #1 things that we have to be considerate of. Children are inherently loyal to their parents and to their families because that is their sole support system. They are reliant upon them for not only love and emotional well-being, but they're reliant on them for their basic needs. Their inability of the victim to understand they're being sexually exploited. Oftentimes our children are in a family system, as Naeshia's mentioned already, in which they are not aware that other families do not function in that manner. So our children often have to have some education around normalized sexual behaviors. Victims of Family Facilitated CSEC are less likely to report. One study found that 63% of intrafamilial abuse victims never disclosed the abuse that they endured to anyone. That is very similar to the CDC's survey from years ago, in which 80% of adults polled reported that they did not report the sexual abuse that they endured. Victims have ongoing contact with their familial trafficker. It's one thing to remove a child from a neighborhood or to remove a child from a situation that's outside of their family, but our children know that they're going back home frequently. And so we need to be cognizant of the fact that that contact with that familial trafficker is 100% of the time. The alert study purports that 60% of Family Facilitated CSEC victims have ongoing contact with their trafficker. So when we look at immediate and long-term outcomes of Family Facilitated CSEC, they often experience psychological and emotional challenges that stem from their victimization and or emerge out of histories of polyvictimization. The following are long-term outcomes of Family Facilitated CSEC. They may include substance dependence disorder, self-injurious behaviors, suicidal behavior, bipolar disorder, low self-worth. When we look at PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the U.S. Department of State cites the level of trauma experienced by CSEC survivors is in the same range as the treatment-seeking combat veterans and victims of state-organized torture. Anxiety and mood disorders, including panic attacks, obsessive compulsive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and major depressive disorder. Dissociative disorders are characterized as the disruption in the family integrated functions of consciousness, memory, identity, and perception. So we have a few case scenarios. We have abbreviated them quite a bit, but our first child is Kayla. Kayla's 15 years old. She's a female who was exploited by her parents between the ages of 13 and 15. Her parents forced her to have a sexual relationship with an adult male in exchange for various bills being paid. The adult male lived in the home with them as well, and the parents used force and coercion. By denying Kayla an education, they refused to allow her to go to school or to be virtually homeschooled. However, they did have a plan in place in the event that the Department of Family and Children's Services came to the home. They had signed her up for an online version of homeschooling, which gives a printout that they have signed her up, that they've paid for the service. So anyone doing a visual sweep of what things are, what's happening in the home, the parent can present that they have signed her up for virtual classes. The parents informed her that she would be put on the road with her father, who was an over-the-road truck driver, if she did not continue her relationship with the offender. Then we have Jayla. Jayla's an 11-year-old youth whose family is well known by local law enforcement due to the family's history of criminal involvement. The youth's family has also had intermittent defects involvement since 2016 due to sexual and physical abuse allegations, which again are not uncommon for intrafamilial family trafficking. Jayla is beginning to misbehave in school and was recently the suspect of a burglary in her neighborhood. I'm so glad we have school counselors on the call, by the way, because you guys spend 1/3 of your lives with our children. And you really are the eyes and the ears. And when you begin to see drastic changes in behaviors at school, that's certainly something to take note of and to consider when working with that child. She's also getting into physical altercations with other students at her school. Recently, defects became involved with the family, and a case manager went to the school to speak with Jayla. During this time, the youth disclosed that her mother was selling sex with her to get money for her father's commissary in prison. So then when we look at considerations that we may have questions around, what are some points of intervention for each of these youth? Feel free to throw it in the chat.
And you can unmute as well if that's easier.
Yeah. Any thoughts, guys, on the points of intervention for each of these youth? At what point could someone have noticed maybe a red flag or a concerning behavior that was happening that needed some investigation? School and neighbors. Thank you, Jershawn. Yes. We have homeschool here in the state of Georgia. I actually homeschool my child. Illegal activities with Jayla. Yes, Melissa, thank you. Unfortunately, despite the fact that there are a lot of homeschooling families that are very well above board, have healthy school and home environments, it is unfortunate that the system is easy to cheat, in which Kayla's parents did. For Melissa, regarding the illegal activities with Jayla, you have a very young child involved in illegal activities or possible illegal activities. Jayla's only 11 years old. So the fact that she's capable of being out and involved with burglaries or is involved in fights at school, those are some fairly extreme behaviors, especially for an 11-year-old child, and it's easy to take note at that point. Thank you both for your comments. When we consider Kayla's scenario, what questions would you ask a youth who's been on run for an extended period of time? Again, chat or you can unmute. Kayla, thank you. Yes, her home life would be a great question. We often view runaway situations as a child being rebellious, but often our kids are running from a situation, and that's very important to take into consideration. Relationship with parents is yet another beautiful example of what could be asked. I saw Jershawn's comment, and let me go back up. Let's see. Is there anything going on in the home that she would like to share? Relationship with parents. Those are very important things that can be asked, and you can ask it in an open narrative format so that you don't feel that you're leading the child to an answer. But it's important for us to give a child an opportunity to talk about why they're running and not just return them immediately to parents. Where was she staying while on run? Yes, Susan, that is such a critical question to ask. We need to make sure that we begin to treat our runaway youth with the same level of concern that we do a child who's suspected of abuse or neglect. If we begin to ask those questions about why are you running, what's happening at home, what's your relationship like, tell me what a day in the life of your family looks like, that can open the door, and that's actually what opened the door with Kayla. Understand that the sheriff's office that dealt with this child's family, they were called because she was missing, but they took note that the parents waited 24 hours before they called. They said that they were searching for her, but it was really neighbors that had encouraged them to report, because apparently they had told their neighbors that she was missing, but they were not reporting it to authorities that could really help with a widespread search. Once they found Kayla, they had conversations with Kayla. Law enforcement sat with her and wanted to know, why did you run? Where have you been? Is there something we can help you with? When Kayla realized she was not in trouble with law enforcement, she began to disclose. That was the catalyst for her. If we continue to pick children up from run and then immediately return them to the front doorstep of their home without asking these critical questions, we are going to miss children who are being trafficked. Lastly, when we consider Jayla's case scenario, what were some of the risk factors for her family facilitated CSEC? When you consider Jayla's story, what do you take note of as far as a risk factor? Let's see, Brett Murphy-Dawson, Dr. Murphy-Dawson, who is she connected to in the community or on the street? Fantastic. Incarcerated father, family being well known to law enforcement, previous DFACS involvement. You guys are stars, absolutely. History of abuse, previous abuse allegations. You know, oftentimes, I mean, I was a forensic interviewer for 21 years, and in those small rooms with children, we do our very best to solicit their narrative statements regarding what may or may not be going on. Children frequently will not disclose. It happens, especially if it's intrafamilial abuse, whether it's physical, sexual, exploitation, whatever it may be. Children feel a primal need to protect their families. When a child has previous history of abuse allegations, it is very important to really dig deep and ask a lot of questions when you begin to see the fighting, the burglaries, the other appearingly rebellious behaviors that they're having. Let's see, Dr. Murphy-Dawson has said risk factors: living with person they are paying for her to have sex with. We see a lot of children who are living with their buyer. Dysfunction in multiple areas from Delantina Robertson, or they recant after disclosing. Susan Williams, that recantation is so very important. Kayla actually completely recanted all of her statements once she was given contact with her family again. Her grandmother had been her support system that she was allowed to be in contact with. She was placed in a safe residential facility. She was doing very well. Once she was placed in that safe environment, it was determined that she could have contact with her family again. I would really like to urge anyone working with children in child welfare services that we don't immediately put contact back with a child when the family is alleged, especially charged with the crimes of intrafamilial sexual trafficking. The parents are going to have a very vested interest in getting that child to recant their statements. And oftentimes the burden of a child, thank you, I'm running a little on time, so I'm going to stop soon. But the burden is on the child's shoulders to protect the family and to bring the family back together. And frequently children are going to recant. We need to take big consideration of recantations.
And I see we have some great questions about just, was there a caseworker involved? So we'll get through these, and Noemi, please don't forget that question, because I think that's a great one that Amy can answer.
So best practices and recommendations, you know, as it's been mentioned throughout this presentation, familial trafficking research is emerging, and we may be at the cusp of understanding how prevalent this issue is. With that being said, the following are research-informed best practices and recommendations for recognizing, quantifying, and understanding family facilitated CSEC and serving the children and families impacted by this form of exploitation. Many victims of family facilitated CSEC have extensive child maltreatment histories. and may have intersected with child welfare due to neglect and concerns. One study found that 94% of confirmed family-facilitated CSEC cases had a primary finding of neglect. Training for child welfare professionals on how to identify youth who are being or have been commercially sexually exploited by caregivers is highly recommended. The limited research on family-facilitated CSEC reveals that it is seldom identified. However, when it is often identified by healthcare providers, child welfare professionals, education providers, and law enforcement professionals. With that, to increase the likelihood of detection and disclosure, healthcare providers, child welfare professionals, and child advocates and other institutions that serve children and families should include screening for family-facilitated CSEC when assessing maltreated youth. You know, there are numerous screening tools for CSEC. However, the Polaris Project has found that a number of these tools are based on the assumption that the trafficker is a boyfriend/pimp and not a parent, that it's someone outside of the family. Recommendations include conducting environmental scans for screening tools specific to family-facilitated CSEC, or modifying existing CSEC screening tools for family-facilitated CSEC. Since data and research is so limited, all agencies that intersect with youth suspected of or confirmed for CSEC should categorize the relationship between trafficker and victim to provide comprehensive data and offer education opportunities for multidisciplinary teams. So as mentioned earlier in our presentation, approximately 60% of family-facilitated CSEC victims have ongoing contact with their trafficker, which obviously poses physical, psychological, and emotional safety risks. When family-facilitated CSEC is suspected, children and youth should be removed or separated from the environment where the exploitation is occurring. Caregiver substance dependence is a critical risk factor. We need to take a look at what the researchers are recommending, and that's that substance-identified caregivers be screened for involvement for the family-facilitated CSEC. Screening should also include other individuals in the life of the parent who may be exploiting the child's substance dependence as a way of gaining access to their children. So how can you help? We always like to include this in every presentation that we do. Here are 3 things you can do to help a child. Avoid using problematic and victim blaming language such as child prostitution. Also consider, if you suspect that a child is involved in trafficking, ensure that you don't discuss with that child things like, you know you shouldn't be doing this, you know you shouldn't be involved with this, you know better than this, you're worth more than this. You really want to sit and listen and report. Host a training or an awareness session in your community and invite our CSEC response team. As Naeshia mentioned before, actually Debaja mentioned before, we have an extremely diverse team. We have an internal multidisciplinary team. We have professionals that have history with public health, law enforcement, DFACS, children's advocacy centers, advocacy in general. It's important that you know that our team can come out free of charge to any form of training or awareness session in your community, and we are happy to provide the information. Also, last but not least, you can call the 1-866-END-HTGA if you suspect that a child is a victim of CSEC. And just to let you know, when you call that hotline, you press number 2 for CSEC concerns, and you're going to get a live human being when you press number 2. Janie, as well as her well-trained advocates that work with her, are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to ensure that they can provide you information, referrals, assistance with placement when possible, as well as to hear any concern you have regarding a child who's suspected of being a victim of CSEC, and they will help you walk through that report system. You can also go directly to our HIPAA compliant web referral, which is at cacga.org/referrals. That's our website. There's a tab that says referral, and all you have to do is punch that tab, and it is a very self-explanatory referral sheet that you'll fill out. The more information you can give our team, the faster we can work through the assessment and come to a conclusion for that child. So here we are at the questions portion.
And we wanted to share briefly just our references. We definitely worked with a lot of great professionals. Big thank you to our forensic interviewers across the state, because we wouldn't have this information without your trained expertise. And then shout out to our interns who worked diligently to collect all the research for us to underscore the information that we're sharing today. So any questions? I know Noemi had the first question, Amy. Was there a caseworker involved, and why was that not a red flag? And I believe, Noemi, are you referring to Kayla or are you referring to Jayla? I just want to make sure we're framing the question correctly. She may have been in
Kayla.
Kayla. Okay, yes. There oh gosh, we're getting feedback. There we go. There was a DFACS professional involved in Kayla's case. In fact, they did remove her from her home after law enforcement determined that there was an issue afoot with CSEC. And we were very grateful for that. I think what's challenging is the entire goal for the Department of Family and Children's Services is to ensure that children can continue to communicate with their families whenever they can safely do so, or to be reunified with their families when it's safe to do so. CSEC, although it is not a new issue, it has certainly posed problems when it comes to policies and procedures, because the policies and procedures for children that are in a deprived situation tend to be a lot different than children that are in a CSEC situation. So again, I would always advise that if there's an active criminal investigation with parents, that the MDT really makes some solid decisions on whether it is safe for a child to have contact with the people that are accused. You know, if it was a stranger, there would be no contact, obviously. When it's a parent, it makes it a much more complex situation. And that does put the Department of Family and Children's Services in a difficult spot. If they don't have someone on the multidisciplinary team that can give them very clear-cut reasons as to why a child cannot have contact with a parent, they have to move forward when they're looking at ensuring that the child has contact with family members. That was a great question.
May I just ask, in regards to that statement, would it be the same if it were intrafamilial child sexual abuse and not specific to trafficking in terms of that no contact recommendation?
Yes. In my years with CACs, if a parent is the one that is being accused, I think all of our agencies have the responsibility to take large considerations as to whether a child should have contact with that said parent. Recantation is often a part of the disclosure process, especially when it's a familial situation. However, contact with the person accused before the criminal investigation is complete and the prosecution element is complete, if that's the case, you see a much higher rate of recantation. And sadly, recantations often sound far more realistic than the actual disclosures do. And again, that's part of the disclosure process as well. So keeping that in mind really can save a child from returning to a dangerous situation.
I think that was our last question, Carla. I saw you put in the chat. We can take one more, but we're so grateful for you all's time today. Again, this is an issue that our team is continuing to explore and collect data on. And so anytime you have questions or just feedback, please feel free to reach out to our team, because we're always happy to provide additional feedback or support, especially as you're working through these family facilitated CSEC cases. Oh, Kathy. Oh, hey, Kathy. Can you differentiate between an acquaintance and a trafficker? So mostly we only separated out that statistic. The acquaintance was the trafficker when we were discussing the statistics a little bit earlier. When we said acquaintance, we were really trying to tease out the fact that the child had some type of familiarity with that person. So they were maybe someone that the child went to school with, someone that the child was familiar with in the neighborhood, opposed to some of our youth they are being trafficked by individuals that they meet randomly sometimes when they run away, individuals that they meet randomly when they are on social media. So we really wanted to tease out the differences between the youth sort of being familiar with that individual and then subsequently trafficking occurring, and then the child just randomly meeting a person and then being trafficked by that person. Because unfortunately, that is the case for a good number of our kids. They may meet someone randomly and then experience exploitation. That's not the majority of what's happening, but it is happening in our state.
Wanda, yes, we can do this session again.
Naeshia and Amy, I am going to share my screen really quickly. So you all should be able to see some of that information, and I just wanted to follow up from the resources that you all provided just kind of on your last couple of slides, and mention that hotline again for folks, and make sure that you all have the number and you have the website. So for those of you that are not familiar, we do have that NHTGA hotline does connect you with a multitude of kind of different partners. So CACGA is one of those partners and does have that strong focus on our CSEC youth here in the state. But if you have a tip or a question or really kind of any information regarding adult trafficking victims, labor trafficking victims, you need to make a police report, whatever the case is, here are those identified partners and their various kind of phone tree outlets that you can connect with via NHTGA, as well as the website. So you're actually able to make those tips or those requests via the website as well as the hotline. So just wanted to kind of share some of that information as well. And thank you guys for bringing that up. And then as well as Amy and Naeshia's contact information and mine. So hope you guys don't mind that I included your contact info. More the merrier, right? So just wanted to make sure that we were including that as kind of folks are getting ready to kind of sign off and adjourn. And Debaja, I think you have kind of a couple of closing comments that you want to kind of share with the group regarding the survey and the certificate.
Yes, thank you, Erica. And again, thank you so very much, Amy and Naeshia, for that information that you provided. I know a lot of people are already saying, can we have it again? Because we recorded it, it will be available on the website as well on the YouTube channel. So please check it out. Please share it with others. That is the key to ending human trafficking, is making sure that individuals are able to recognize the signs and then stop it, and make sure that we're notifying the appropriate authorities as well. So again, thank you all for joining us today. Please make sure you fill out the survey to get your certificate. And then, of course, this is not the only conversation that we're going to have. So in January, on January 26th, that is a Wednesday at noon, we will start talking about labor trafficking. A lot of times we talk a lot about human trafficking and we think about only the sex trafficking part. But unfortunately, we do have a growing area of labor trafficking. So please make sure you mark your calendars for that date as well. And again, just a reminder to make sure you take some time for self-care. These types of information can be very disheartening at times. So it's around the holiday season, so we're already dealing with various stressors. So please make sure you take some time to have some self-care for yourself. Thank you again. Please make sure you fill out the survey. Let us know how you enjoyed it and what things do you want to hear about more. We look forward to talking with you in the new year. Have a great holiday season, and we'll see you in January. Thank you again, ladies.
Thank you, Debaja. Thank you, Amy and Naeshia. And just from a CJCC standpoint, thank you, Work Group 1, for all of the work that you have done to make these Lunch and Learns possible. Thank you for those that have signed on and joined us today. Please make sure that you're kind of staying abreast of the future Lunch and Learns that we have, bringing in several other partners to present on topical information as it regarding to HT. So thank you guys so much. Thank you. Big shout out to Work Group 1 and Carla. I appreciate your guidance and your leadership. If you all need anything, feel free to reach out. And I think that is it. We are adjourned. I look forward to seeing you guys all in the new year.
Thank you. Thank you.